I want to welcome everyone to the monthly meeting of the Parrot Club. This is February 23rd, 2022. And I'm very excited to have with us Lauren Schmaltz, who's the U.S. Administrator for the World Parrot Trust, who's going to be talking to us about why save parrots. And she'll be giving a talk, an overview of what the World Parrot Trust does around the world, so we can get a better idea of how they're working to help save parrots. And just a little bit about Lauren. Lauren completed a dual bachelor's degree in biology and Spanish and a Master of Environmental Studies. In the midst of her studies, she also spent several years living in the Galapagos, Costa Rica, and Bonaire. She first became involved with the World Parrot Trust while serving as the director of ECHO, a small nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the yellow-shouldered Amazon parrot and its fragile dry forest habitat on the Dutch Caribbean island of Bonaire. She returned to the U.S. from Bonaire in 2017, having stepped down from that role to dedicate herself to working full-time with World Parrot Trust. She has a keen interest in environmental management, community outreach and education, and sustainable development that harmonizes well with World Parrot Trust's growing initiatives in parrot conservation, habitat restoration, and community engagement. So without further ado, we'll switch this over to Lauren.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that introduction. Thanks to all of you for joining me tonight and spending your evening with me to learn a little bit more about the work of the World Parrot Trust. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share now. Hopefully everyone should be looking at my introductory slide. So just a kind of early on disclosure that for the narrative of the presentation, I find it's easiest if I'm just going to use the royal we. Now, I'll try to be very specific and give credit where credit is due and specifically name the partners that we're working with. But when I talk about work on the ground happening in the countries where the parrots are found, oftentimes this is done through a partnership between the World Parrot Trust and the people that we were working with on the ground to do the actual hands-on direct conservation education research initiatives. And where it is specifically a World Parrot Trust contractor or employee, I'll also try to be clear. But if there's questions at the end of the presentation about specifically the names of partners who are involved in different areas where we work, I'm happy to share those and kind of go into further detail at that time. So just to begin, the talk tonight will be a general overview. I'll begin with an introduction and a history of parrots, both in the wild and in companion care. Many of you probably will know a lot of these facts and information already just from having parrots in the home or being fans of them in the wild. And so I'll try to keep that rather limited. And after that, what I'll do is I'll go into depth about the specific activities and areas where World Parrot Trust is involved, excuse me. So really quickly, what is it about parrots that makes them so fascinating and unique and desirable to have in the home? They have this unique combination of really specialized beaks and also specialized feet. So they have a short and curved bill, which can be used for manipulating objects, and it also serves as a third foot for climbing. The upper jaw is mobile. Now, these beaks are similar in shape to birds of prey, but they also have zygodactyl feet, which is 2 toes pointing forward and 2 toes pointing backwards, which allows them to grasp and manipulate and gives them remarkable dexterity. Zygodactyl feet is a trait that we see in woodpeckers and cuckoos, but there's no other bird in the world besides the parrot family that has that combination of those unique beaks and those unique feet. So what do those beaks and feet allow them to do? Well, it allows them to use tools. And then they have this incredible intellect, which allows them to mimic and form complex social structures and makes them some of the smartest birds out there. And that enables them to solve problems and be highly adaptable to their environment. Parrots typically will mate for life. They form long-term parrot bonds. This is, of course, not across the board. There are exceptions to those rules. They typically produce fewer offspring and will provide longer-term care to those offspring. And they have high faithfulness. So pairs will stay together and continue to mate year after year with that same partner. They are long-lived, so some species can live up to 100 years, and they have delayed maturity, so they're not reproducing right away within their first couple years of life. They're going to be reproducing more into kind of their teenage, middle-aged years. Now, some of those traits is also what puts them at risk when we start to get into the threats of the things that are affecting populations in the wild. So there's around 400 existing species across the world. They can be both generalists and specialists, and you can find them kind of almost in any environment on the planet. As you see in this picture here, they come in a variety of sizes and shapes and colors. And I see those on the call among everyone here with us tonight. You all have everything from cockatiels to macaws and grays to cockatoos. So yeah, it's just incredible how diverse and fascinating and colorful they can be. So where can we find parrots? They can live in the rainforest, in tropical islands, in the desert, even in snow-capped mountains, temperate forests, coastal areas, high elevation, all of the above. They live across the planet in a variety of environments and terrains, which is what makes them such a fascinating group to work with. So they're relatively new to Africa and South America, dating in Africa only back between 1.5 and 7 million years ago, and in South America only around 1.5 million years ago. What this map from BirdLife International is showing us is their diversity of species in the different regions where they're found. So you'll find a higher diversity in South America and in Australia than in other parts of the world. The earliest records are actually found in parts of Europe. And I don't have the dating back to when those records were found. Oh, around 50 million years ago, sorry. So all of these traits have made parrots for hundreds and thousands of years, hundreds to thousands of years, desirable to have in the home and as companions to humans. So all pet parrots have come from wild birds. Most of them have only been in captivity for the last few generations, with the exception of the budgies and the cockatiels, which have been bred in captivity for much longer. In the 1980s and 90s, millions of them were being imported from the wild to be had as companion pets. Nowadays, most of those are captive bred, but there's in the millions that are still kind of not quite in forever homes, either in shelters or being fostered. And it's because of the fact that they're so intelligent and that they need so much enrichment in their lives, as all of you can probably much better understand than myself, just how demanding and how high maintenance a parrot can be in the house, no matter how small. And I think a lot of people are attracted to the colors, to the mimicry, to, you know, the status symbol that a parrot might provide, or one assumes they might provide. And oftentimes we see people are bringing them into the home without proper education and preparedness for what having a bird in the home will entail. Thankfully, in the mid-2000s, the EU put a trade ban on, and so that stopped most import of birds from the wild into Europe, and the US followed closely thereafter with similar laws. But as I said, that still keeps a lot of birds already in captivity in the US that are struggling to find forever homes. And it's not addressing the fact that there are developing countries where the demand for companion birds is increasing, even as we're seeing the demand for companion birds in developed countries like Europe and in the US, either kind of stabilizing or declining. So of the around 400 species, looking now at the wild parrots, about 30% or 1/3 of all of those are under some type of threat, anywhere from near threatened to critically endangered. And the reasons for this come most significantly from bird trade, habitat destruction, hunting and persecution, and introduced species. And we'll kind of get into each of those threats a little more in depth in the following slides. So the capture for the live bird trade and habitat loss and these other factors is what's putting wild parrots at risk. And while many of the species that we work with are suffering from a combination of these pressures, what affects one species in one part of the world will be different from what may affect another species in another part of the world. And it's not necessarily just one of these threats or necessarily all of them. And so that's why a lot of our work is trying to first identify what is the threat that's affecting a particular population of birds? How significant is that threat? And then we have to get into the steps of what are the actions we can take to mitigate those threats or eliminate them. And that'll be the latter half of the presentation. So a closer look at these threats, starting with bird trade. So this is probably one of the most significant threats to parrots, and it continues to be one of the most significant threats to the parrots, even as we're seeing the demand for companion birds in more developed parts of the world decreasing. It's because, as I said, it's both a domestic and an international problem. While folks in the US may not be particularly not looking for wild sourced birds anymore, there are people in countries that are within range states of the birds that are still kind of culturally accepting the idea of having birds in the home, and where there's a lack of education and information about adequate care for those birds in the home, then you see higher mortality rates. And that means that it's very simple for them to go right back out to the local market and buy another bird, which has been sourced from the wild, and bring it back into the home again. And so those are the areas where we need to increase our amount of education and outreach to kind of inform people, first of all, that sourcing birds from the wild, or any wildlife really, is a challenging and difficult thing, and it can lead to the loss of biodiversity. And secondly, that when you're bringing an animal into the home, there are certain quality of life aspects that need to be addressed in order to optimize that animal's welfare. So when birds are being sourced from the wild for trade, oftentimes, unfortunately, what leads to high mortality rates is the fact that the practices for catching those birds are often inhumane. So we've seen instances of folks putting glue on branches in order to catch the birds. Oftentimes we see a lot of poaching of nests to get to chicks, and that involves the destruction of the nest. Or we've seen using decoys to attract other birds, poisoning of water sources to get to wild mammals, which in turn also affects the birds because it can cause death. And that's just to get the bird from where you find them in the wild. From there, they're oftentimes transported to another location, either for domestic sale in a market or for international sale on an airline or a ship. And in that transport, oftentimes they're put into inappropriately sized containers. They're jam-packed in there. They're not fed or watered during that time. Sometimes we see them being mixed with other species, other groups of birds, and that can cause disease transmission. So we estimate that in some cases, just during that transport phase, we're seeing 40 to 70% mortality of the birds that were originally sourced. And then, of course, after that, when there's inadequate care, or then those birds have a shortened lifespan. What it also means with trade is that when you're catching adults, you're often targeting individuals that are in the prime of their breeding years, which can create a population bottleneck because you're removing reproductive adults from the population. So the second, I would say, most significant threat, not that I'm necessarily prioritizing threats and saying one is more urgent or more dire than another, but I would say that trade and habitat destruction, habitat loss are probably the top priorities, the top threats that are affecting parrots around the world. So clearing land for agriculture and for ranching causes parrots to lose access to the vital food, nesting, and roost resources. This is a photo of Mopane woodland in Malawi, where a researcher that we supported, Tawangigawa, discovered that Lillian's lovebirds are critically dependent on mature stands of Mopane woodland for nesting and roosting resources. And so the loss of this woodland type can create population crashes for the Lillian's lovebirds. Another threat is hunting and persecution. So there are parrots that are crop raiders. This is a photo that comes from Bonaire prior to my time there, but the yellow-shouldered Amazon would forage feed on the maishi crops, which is like a sorghum wheat. And we know that this also happens with red-fronted macaws in Bolivia that are feeding on corn. And so for subsistence farmers where, they're seeing a large portion of their field just getting attacked by birds, and the largest, loudest birds are the ones that you can kind of most easily target, well, it doesn't end happily for the parrots in a lot of cases. And in fact, with the yellow-shouldered Amazon on the island of Aruba, it was hunting and persecution that led to the extirpation, so the extinction of that species on that island. And that means that the population is less diverse, is less widespread than it was historically, when we lose subpopulations of particular species from a place where they used to occur. And again, in these cases, these tend to be adults who may be in breeding age. So again, can create a bottleneck for the population if you're removing a lot of those individuals from the group. Another threat is introduced species. So here is a nest box from our partners Macaw Recovery Network in Costa Rica of Africanized bees, which have taken over an artificial nest box that the team had put out to help support great green macaw reproduction. We see honeybees becoming competitors with parrots in a lot of cases, in a lot of places as well. So Puerto Rico, we know this to be a problem where they've driven out a female that was incubating eggs. In Bonaire, we've seen in the past instances where the bees actually had stung chicks to death in order to take over a cavity. And we also know this is a problem with the Lear's macaw, where Erica Pacifico is doing a lot of research with her team and is working on ways to, to remove the honeybees prior to the Lear's macaw breeding season so that they have access to limited cliff cavities. Other examples of invasive species would be the stoats, which are predating on cacas in New Zealand, or the sugar gliders, which are predating on female swift parrots in nests in Tanzania. And in that case, they're actually creating an imbalanced sex ratio because there's fewer females now in the population than males. And that can have much longer term and more significant impacts on the populations of swift parrots than just, one nest that's taking over from a bee colony. So with all of this, what do we do? And that's where the work of the World Parrot Trust comes in. So just reminding ourselves that parrots are unique and special. They're an incredibly popular pet. There are millions of them in captivity. Many, sadly, are still not well cared for. And of the around 400 species that exist in the world, about a third of those are threatened in the wild. And so our approach is to try to work on all of these issues. And we engage with a variety of partners, and we like to partner directly with in-country entities and individuals, organizations, governments who are in the places where the parrots can be found and working on the ground. And what we do is we enable those people to make direct, significant actions by providing financial, technical, logistical support to their work. So our founder, Mike Reynolds, is quoted as saying, if we save parrots, we might yet save ourselves. And so for the World Parrot Trust, what is best for the birds is going to guide everything that we do. And many of our approaches are looking at the population-wide impacts rather than individualized care, while the welfare of every individual bird, of course, is of concern and of importance to us in terms of making significant impacts for the protection of parrots around the planet. We really want to try to maximize our impact and minimize our resources to have that effect by looking at population-wide factors. So that's why we are working directly to address threats like wildlife. How is the wildlife trade happening, and where can we get involved to interrupt it when it's illegal, or to inform when it is still legal and we don't agree with it? So in order to have those actions, it starts with research, and from the research and the information that we gather to better understand the species in the wild, then we can formulate direct conservation actions. As I said, we're going to try to stop wildlife trade. An example of direct conservation actions includes protecting habitat and restoring it where it's been degraded or lost. And of course, in all of our activities, it requires the education and awareness of the people who are coexisting with the parrots in the wild. And then finally, when there are birds in our home, how can we optimize care so that their welfare is also looked after? Because our origins do come from people who have birds in captivity. World Parrot Trust was founded in 1989 by Mike Reynolds at Paradise Park in Cornwall, United Kingdom. And Paradise Park is a wildlife sanctuary. So Mike had brought in a lot of individuals into their sanctuary, and kind of the light went off one day where he said, well, where are these birds coming from? They're coming from the wild. What does that leave the individuals that are still in the wild if we're removing them from the wild? So he realized that we needed to do something to protect parrots in the wild to ensure that they would be there for posterity. And that's how the World Parrot Trust got started. And as I said, that was back in 1989 when we were kind of still becoming more aware of the trickle-down effects of our actions. So getting into more details about starting with research. To this day, parrots are really generally not well researched. There's a lot to be developed in the field. A lot of that is because they can be in places that are difficult to access. They can occur in countries which are politically unstable. They can be very cryptic. They can live in habitats that are not very accessible. And so that makes them hard to study. And so that means that we're still learning a lot about how they live in the wild. What do they eat? How do they coexist? How do they socialize? Where do they breed? And without knowing more about their lifestyle, if you will, we can't really know what the specific threats are that are affecting them and how we can mitigate and minimize those threats. So examples of research that we've participated in and supported in the past include looking at the Timna parrots, and the top left photo is from Guinea-Bissau. So this was the first recorded footage of breeding behavior of Timna parrots in the wild, and you can see there's an adult that is well camouflaged on the tree here, and there are 3 little chicks poking their heads out of the nest cavity here. So this was really important to better understand their nesting behavior, and also understand what they were feeding on was a part of that study. And you'll see that in a later slide. To the right of that, this is the black-cheeked lovebird. So right now, World Parrot Trust is supporting a PhD student, Sasha Deuker, and he is doing a genetic analysis of all the lovebird population, lovebird species, to better understand their, like, where they're still found in the wild, what are the threats that are impacting the populations in the wild, is there hybridization happening? Because as their habitat is becoming reduced, we're finding that there are places where there are different species of lovebirds that are starting to overlap. Does that mean they're hybridizing in the wild? Because that can have a significant conservation and biodiversity impact. And so that's a lot of stuff that's just now kind of developing. In the lower left-hand corner, these are the yellow-shouldered Amazon parrots. They're feeding on a native calabash fruit. So that's one of their favorite fruits. As a conservation partner, something that ECHO will do is make sure that they're sourcing calabash fruit. And I think Amy was talking about another researcher down at University of Miami. It's so important to understand what their wild diets are, because not only can we make sure that we're protecting the sources of those wild diets, so restoring trees or protecting mature trees, but we can also look for ways to cross that over into companion bird care. Is there a way that we can source these materials sustainably to also feed to the birds that are in companion care, because that will make them healthier and longer lived. And so ECHO will try to source calabash fruits for the birds that they still have in captivity, which are non-releasable. In the lower right-hand corner, we have a greenwing and a hyacinth sharing a water source where they're obtaining minerals, which are critical for them. Some more examples of research, again, as I was referring to with the Timnes. So this, in this study, which was done back in 2014 in Guinea-Bissau, they discovered like over 30 different plant types that the Timnes were feeding on, which was much more than they expected and included some things that they didn't anticipate finding. And so that was a fascinating discovery, which tells us a lot more about this particular species in that particular location, and what might impact it down the road. In the middle, we have the yellow-naped Amazon. So we work and support work with and support Tim Wright out of New Mexico State. And he has started the New Mexico State he has started the Mesoamerican census. And that is just trying to get people to report sightings of the yellow-naped Amazon, because the yellow-naped has been recently upgraded to critically endangered. So anybody who's traveling throughout Central America can report if they've seen a yellow-naped Amazon and kind of provide that data to this collaboration of different researchers, networks, organizations that are all interested in the yellow-naped Amazon. And that way we can learn more about their whereabouts, about their numbers. So we have a student, Tim has a student in Costa Rica that we're supporting, who is revisiting all of the roost sites that Tim's team had visited many years ago, to kind of see how those roost sites have changed over time. Have the sizes changed? Are we discovering new nest sites? And unfortunately, I mean, which is why it's become critically endangered, we're finding that the species is much reduced in the wild now. And so habitat loss seems to be one of the most significant factors for that. So also looking at habitat needs, as I kind of referred to earlier when looking at the threats that affect parrots in the wild, this is again the Lillian's lovebirds. And as I mentioned, they're critically dependent on mature stands of Mopane woodlands, which are being lost for slash and burn agriculture and charcoal production. And so we're still, what they've just done in recent months is that they've trialed a study of putting out nest boxes, and they're going to so this is Sasha and Tawange and a team that they've assembled there in Malawi and Zambia to put out nest boxes close to roost sites and also far from roost sites, and see whether the Lillians will occupy those nest boxes. So in the absence of suitable habitat, we often see partners relying on artificial nest boxes to provide a secure nesting location for parrots to continue doing what they'd like to and what they need to do in order to keep the populations surviving. And then in the lower left-hand corner, again, this is Erica Pacifico's team with the Lear's macaws in Brazil. And so in the back, what you see are the cliffs, and it's in these tiny cavities where the Lear's macaws are breeding. And again, loss of habitat is a factor affecting them, but more significantly, what she's been addressing in recent years is direct competition with honeybees for those cavities to breed. This is a brief video going back to the Timne research that was done in Guinea-Bissau, just to kind of give you a firsthand encounter. So you will have seen in that video that there was kind of a V-shaped notch cut at the bottom of the nest, and that was from poachers who had macheted into the nest cavity in order to make it more accessible to reach the chicks. And in fact, so these were a few islands off of the mainland of Guinea-Bissau that were national parks, and there was a community on one of the inhabited islands where some members of the community had, were in the practice of traveling over to the uninhabited island and poaching chicks for trade. And thankfully, because of the research, because of the direct collaboration with the rangers of the protected area and learning more about the populations of timnahs found in Guinea-Bissau, there was an instance where a chick had been poached from a nest that they were monitoring, and word got out among the community, and anonymously in the middle of the night, the chick thankfully was healthy and safe and was returned to the headquarters of the park, and the rangers were able to put it back in the nest, and the parents did readily return to feed it, and that little chick's name was Bananas. And that's just a reassuring story that when you're working directly on the ground with the communities where the parrots are found, and they're engaged and a part of the process of doing the research and applying the conservation actions, then you can have those positive results. So from research, another element of research is to do monitoring. So this is informing us as to what's happening with populations over time. So we're looking at trends, and from those trends, we can try to identify significant events which may explain any changes in the trends that we're observing. So in the top kind of purplish photo at the top of the slide, what you're seeing is a group of African greys returning to a roost in Nigeria, which in fact, this roost was in a large mature tree enclosed within a walled compound of a palm oil production. So typically we would think of palm oil as being very habitat destructive, very water resource intensive, and not generally good for wildlife. But in this particular case, it's a very unique situation where because the tree had been saved, because it was within this walled compound of this farm, the African greys had a secure place to roost at night. And interestingly, the people who worked in the palm oil field, when the researchers arrived there in the early morning hours to watch the greys fly out from the roost and try to document where they were going to out in the adjoining nature areas to forage and roost throughout the day, they noticed that there were workers from the palm oil facility that were also there in the wee hours of the morning, and they were there to collect feathers that had been naturally shed overnight by the parrots, because those feathers are very often used still for traditional medicinal practices. Sorry. In the lower left-hand corner, we have a photo of a local team member from ECHO who is participating in the annual roost count that they do at the end of January every year. And they've been doing that count since 2015 annually. And what we found is that the trend for the yellow-shouldered Amazons on Bonaire is increasing, potentially stabilizing, and that we can see kind of a dramatic increase in the population numbers following some interventions. So following an intensive education and outreach campaign, which was done by an organization called RARE back in the mid 1990s. They went to Bonaire, they did a year-long kind of engagement, education, awareness raising, kind of just getting the community really on board. They linked that with an amnesty campaign, which World Parrot Trust did support at the time, where all of the companion birds on Bonaire were ringed. And so, they were legalized. And beyond that point, it was the community knew it was no longer allowed to have a bird brought in from a nest that was found in the wild. And and that's had a positive impact on the population of yellow-shouldered Amazons on Bonaire since that time. And of course, ECHO having a continued presence since 2010 has also boded well for the population, to the point where the yellow-shouldered Amazon has recently been downgraded from considered vulnerable to considered near threatened. And that's thanks to a lot of the success that both the island of Bonaire through ECHO and the island of Isla Margarita, which pertains to Venezuela through another NGO called Provida, have been able to do in terms of being really actively involved with the residents on the island and with direct conservation actions. Another example of monitoring in the lower right-hand corner. So this is for the red-fronted macaw, again in Bolivia, where there hasn't been a population-wide census of the species since 2010. And so our partners at Parrot Conservation Bolivia would really like to replicate a census because it's suspected that the population has become fragmented and that they're kind of forming these distinct subpopulations because of loss of habitat, because of conflict with growers, because of poaching that still is occurring in the area. And so that's that's an activity that's been impeded due to the pandemic, but remains a high priority for our partners in Bolivia to get a new kind of count, a new estimate of what's happening with the red-fronted macaw population, because that is a critically endangered species. And so gathering this information is important for making conservation actions and priorities. So from research, we get into conservation. So the large picture of this adorable little naked chick is from Belize Bird Rescue. And I think Amy said that you had a speaker from Belize, so perhaps this was Nikki or someone else associated with the yellow-headed Amazon. So the yellow-headed Amazon is still significantly at threat for poaching. And the Belize Bird Rescue, with a number of other in-country partners, has identified nests they know are at high risk for being poached year after year. And so what they do is they go in and they remove the chicks early on in the process, and they raise them in captivity and then release them at a later date once the fledglings have kind of grown strong enough and mature enough that they're no longer at risk for being poached. And then they're kind of returned to the same point of origin where they were taken from the nests. And so that's a direct intervention that we've seen work successfully in a variety of places. There's also been instances where that's a conservation action that doesn't necessarily work out. So again, it's so much of this is kind of what might work in one place won't necessarily work in another. It's kind of trial and error. And that's why for the World Parrot Trust, it's so important to work directly with people on the ground who understand the politics, who understand the communities, who are part of the communities, and who understand the environments in which they're working, because that will determine which are the appropriate actions to take for the benefit of the species that's of interest. In the top right-hand corner, what we see is another photo from Parrots Conservation Bolivia. This time, this is of the blue-throated macaw in the Beni department of Bolivia. So what we're working with is not only the local nonprofit, Parrots Conservation Bolivia, but they are helping build capacity and build independence among the municipal protected areas, which for us in the States would be likened to a state park or a county park. And oftentimes these municipal protected areas have been created, but because of the political situation and because of how impoverished Bolivia is, there's not necessarily always the resources or the will to manage those protected areas effectively or completely. And so what Parrots Conservation Bolivia is trying to do is really enhance the ability of the people who are dedicated and contracted to manage those spaces so that they're fully informed and capable of looking out for the endangered species that occur within those protected areas. So the blue-throated macaw is another critically endangered species. We know that they have some loss of nesting cavities. They suffer from these torrential rains every breeding season, ironically, which is when the blue throats like to breed. And they like to nest in these dead palm trees. And so the palms will either be flooded out, or they can fall because they get inundated, or they're on unstable soils. And that can lead to a loss of the natural nests. And so one thing that the Gran Mojos Municipal Protected Area, which is seen here in this photo, is doing is partnering with Parrots Conservation Bolivia to learn how to make artificial nest boxes, install those nest boxes, manage those nest boxes so that there are drain holes so that the nest box won't flood, so that they can remove bees if the bees colonize it. And they can also, if needed, they can check on the chicks and intervene. So this happened last year. There was perhaps a new pair of blue-throated macaws inexperienced at raising chicks, and there was a chick that was found to be malnourished and not well cared for by the parents. And so the team from Parrots Conservation Bolivia, along with the municipal protected area staff, for 40 days went in and they gave supplemental feeding and they did health checks of this chick. And thankfully, fortunately, by the end, that chick did successfully fledge from the nest, and the parrots, remained involved, but they weren't. They were still learning, and they weren't providing sufficient care for. And under natural circumstances, with no intervention, that chick would not have made it through the breeding season. And for a critically endangered species, every individual you can add to the population is significant. In the lower right-hand corner, this is the Puerto Rican Amazon project. And what you see, that little necklace around the neck, is a transmitter. So in Puerto Rico, we're working really closely with the Department of Natural Resources and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to help them with the Puerto Rican Amazons. And they have a really successful breeding captivity program. And from the breeding and captivity, they're making releases. And they're also now doing much more with our technical support, doing much more nest monitoring of wild nests that are becoming established, and installing artificial nest boxes to just, have as many potential breeders actually breeding if they can. And that will just augment the population, help that population recover, because in the 70s, it was down to a few dozen individuals, if not less. And then, of course, when you have external impacts that you can't control for, like Hurricane Maria, that can be devastating for a population if you have a really, really small population. And so it's important to have this kind of hands-on management when your numbers are low, to make sure that you're, that you're safeguarding the outcome for every individual of that population. Other examples of conservation in action. So I spoke earlier about how most of our approaches are really focused on population-wide interventions and actions. But there are partners of the World Parrot Trust where they've really dedicated themselves to the welfare of all birds, and they've gotten really good at doing that. And so, of course, we, where we can support, we are always looking to support. And so the top left corner is from a partner in Brazil called ASM Cambaquara, and they are on an island off of the coast of Brazil, kind of southeast of Sao Paulo. And for them, oftentimes they're brought many, many, many conures, and those conures are either coming from nests that were made inside people's rooftops, or they're immature birds that ran into a window. And so they've had just, some of the worst case scenarios have come through their doors, and thanks to their dedicated care, a lot of those have had really successful outcomes, to the point where the individuals who seemed beyond repair were able to be returned to the wild. And so those are always great conservation outcomes, because as many birds as you can get back out in the wild, the more stable and sustainable the population will be. In the top right-hand corner, this is a pair of scarlet macaws from our partners in Honduras, Pro Alas. So they've just recently wrapped their breeding season, and between birds that they're having breed in captivity for later release and the birds that they are supporting who are breeding in the wild of reintroduced scarlet macaws in the Copan Ruinas, they had close to 40 birds just fledged this last year, which is really exciting. Every year now, Pro Alas and their for-profit partners, Macaw Mountain, who World Parrot Trust also supports, they're doing these releases of scarlet macaws at the Copan ruins. And not only is this great because it is good for tourism, which is a main driver of the economy of that area, but it brings a lot of awareness and pride to the local communities who are dependent on that tourism. They do a lot of education and outreach, which we'll touch on later as well, to get the communities just fully on board and excited about these activities. And they just have had great success with the macaws. And it's I'm very much looking forward to the day when I can make a trip to Honduras and get to see the macaws flying free over the ruins. It's just the footage from there is spectacular. In the lower left-hand corner, this is a great green macaw feeding chicks in an artificial nest box at our partners at RM Manzanillo. So they, through their assisted reproduction program in Costa Rica, have contributed some of the most numbers of birds into the great green macaw population in Costa Rica. So this is an example again where supporting the population in the wild and improving their odds at being able to reproduce successfully and being able to ensure the fledging of every chick that is produced has made a significant difference for the population on a whole. In the lower right-hand corner, this is kind of like an iconic story of coming back from the brink of extinction and how conservation can have a lasting impact on a species in the wild. This is with the echo parakeet. And in 1990, the Jarrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, in partnership with the Mauritian government and, Carl Jones with World Parrot Trust, was able to do a variety of different conservation actions, including breeding in captivity, putting out nest boxes, managing the health of the nestlings in order to increase the productivity of the population in the wild. And thankfully, they were able to come back, and they have around 700 individuals in the wild population now. And that's after 2 decades of intensive research management. So it seems far too distressingly easy to become endangered, and recovering from endangerment is a long haul, and it requires intense input of resources, human resources, time, money, and effort from everyone involved. And so anything we can do to prevent species from getting to that point, obviously, is the preferred way to go. Just so you really kind of get the feeling for what it means to do conservation in the field, because this is not something that is for the faint of heart. It's not something for folks who don't really kind of literally live and breathe doing conservation. I'm going to show a short video clip of hyacinth macaw nest monitoring that was done again through partners at Parrots Conservation in Bolivia. And so these are guys who are about 100 feet up in the air in a tree. They're putting up trap cameras, or they're checking the trap cameras for the hyacinth macaw nest to check on the kind of the stages of the chicks as they're preparing to leave for the nest, and ensure that poaching's not happening of that nest. And so I'll just go ahead and show that now. So you'll see he's leaning down to that device. He is tied in with ropes. You can hear the parents aren't thrilled about having these people here. There's the trap camera. So you don't want to get all the way up there and realize you forgot the batteries, you know. Oftentimes these are batteries that are having to be replaced every 2 weeks at a minimum. The trap cameras are recording the activities of the parents going into the nest. Ideally, in some cases, the trap cameras will be positioned to track the day that the chicks fledge. So we can use that information to better understand how long chicks remain in nests before they reach an age where they're able to fledge. And that will also tell us, because oftentimes poachers are getting there right before the chicks are ready to fledge, because that means, you know, they're a lot easier to manage at that stage, and they can be kind of hand weaned for the last few weeks until they're fully feathered and fledged. So other examples of conservation, and a major theme of the work of the World Parrot Trust, is to protect habitat and restore it where it's been degraded. again, thinking about things from kind of a population-wide or a species-wide approach, if we can protect habitat, oftentimes we're not just talking about the individual species of parrot of concern, but we're talking about a diversity of other wildlife that exists within that habitat, and kind of the ecosystems that form that habitat. And you're not just protecting an individual bird, you're protecting its food resources, its nesting resources. So this is a much longer term approach and a much broader scale approach to species conservation. So in the background photo, this is from that Gran Mojos Municipal Protected Area. So throughout Bolivia, there's already a lot of established either national parks or municipal protected areas. I mean, Bolivia just has incredible biodiversity. But in the Beni department, where the blue-throated macaw is found, World Parrot Trust worked with local partners, the local government, and the the Parrots Conservation Bolivia group to establish this Gran Mojos Municipal Protected Area, which harbors about 35% of the known wild population and 50% of the known breeding pairs. So by establishing an official protected area and kind of working directly with the community to educate them more and inform them about the status of the species in the wild, you're having a much larger impact than just focusing, although equally important, on the reproductive potential of breeding pairs. Other examples of habitat restoration is again back on Bonaire. So there, through a government grant and with support from the World Parrot Trust, ECHO was able to establish over 33 hectares of protected areas of the dry forest and has been selectively restoring them with, I think, over 15,000 trees at this point. And so these are trees that are native trees to the island. They're not only going to be providing in the future food and nesting resources for the parrots, but they're going to be helping the microclimates on that island. They're going to be shoring up soil. Sorry. And I'm in my office. Just 1 minute. So sorry for that. I will have to figure out how to mute my phone for future presentations. So the trees planted is also shoring up soils. That's helping sediment runoff. So Bonaire in the Caribbean has some of the best remaining coral reef ecosystems. So, there's so many different aspects involved of conservation, and you have to really think about how everything is interlinked, and how one intervention, what are the impacts of that going to be, positively or negatively, before you take that action. And that's also why kind of creating species action plans or protected area plans is important, because it gives us a more holistic approach to what we're trying to do for the welfare of parrots in the wild. So this comes from a summer campaign that we did actually, well, 2.5 years ago now, in 2019, to help save Bolivia's macaws. So just really quick. Some of you will remember this was the summer that Australia also suffered just dramatically from the bushfires which occurred. So something that we are working on now with the partners in Bolivia is to do forest fire prevention, and also response, because with climate change, we expect that we're going to see increasing numbers of wildfires, severity of wildfires. This is not only affecting the parrots, but of course it's affecting other native wildlife. And the more we can get ahead of it and build capacity on the ground among the rangers of those protected areas to address these threats, the greater impact we'll have, for the species that occur there. So looking at wildlife trade, still there's a lot of research to be done. We'd like to see better legislation in some places where legal trade is still occurring. And then of course, where the laws are on the books, we'd like to help make sure that enforcement and confiscations of illegal shipments are on the rise. And we're seeing some really great things coming out of Africa these days through our work with Dr. Rowan Martin, who leads our Africa program, and the local partners that he's been able to set up, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We are seeing more confiscations happening. He just is finishing a trip. I forget which country he went to, where he's trying to educate the people who are on the front lines. So the officials who are checking shipments prior to departure, to educate them about species identification, to educate them about how to give some kind of immediate care, how to build a temporary aviary if you find an illegal shipment of parrots, so that we can give them the tools and the information that they need so they feel empowered to enforce the laws that are on the books. And that's kind of what gets into the rescue, rehab, and release aspect. For a frontline officer who's probably maybe not getting paid really well, and there's documents presented and they seem official, and there are birds in the crate, and the document states that there's going to be birds in the shipment, they may suspect that this is not, on the up and up. But if they were to confiscate that shipment, all of a sudden they have hundreds of birds on their hands that they're responsible for. And a lot of, you can understand not wanting to take on that risk and have that responsibility. And so it may be easier to just kind of turn a blind eye and allow the shipments go through. And so what we're trying to do is work with those officials to make them feel a little bit more in control and empowered to be able to intervene when they know that that there's illegal activity taking place. And we're seeing that, this is not only affecting parrots. Oftentimes you're seeing young chimpanzees mixed in with those shipments. And so coincidentally, World Parrot Trust is working really closely with a lot of chimpanzee sanctuaries in different parts of Africa, because both parrots and chimps are getting caught up in the same kind of trade routes or on the same shipments. And in the photo, this is a thick-billed parrot, which was actually among parrots which were confiscated in 2018 or 19 in Indonesia. And this photo comes from our Indonesia program manager, Med Alawate. So Indonesia is another place where we're seeing wildlife trade kind of being the most significant and prevalent as a threat to parrot species, particularly given the diversity of parrots that are found across Indonesia. So our wildlife trade is covered under the broad banner of Fly Free, which was a campaign we started many years ago, and we've just kind of kept that as one of our programs. And so everything we do under Fly Free is, addressing every step of the trade route. So whether it is working with governments to enforce legislation or working with governments to create legislation where better protections need to be in place for wild populations, or whether it's working with the border control, the airlines, the local governments, to make sure that if there are illegal shipments, that there are, interventions and people are stopping those from taking place and confiscations happen. And then, of course, once a confiscation has happened, providing resources, providing tools, providing information on how to rescue those birds, rehabilitate them, and where to appropriately release them. So in Indonesia, that's definitely an issue because we have a lot of subspecies. And so it's really important to know not necessarily even just the island that that animal needs to be returned to, but the specific location on the island where that bird needs to be returned to. And that's where Med has been really instrumental in working with the local government, nature entities. They, they're doing the confiscations, their heart's in the right place. They want to get these birds back out to the wild, but they need to know specifically where those birds need to go. And so they have to be better educated about identifying subspecies and recognizing those and where to return them to. So we also support global awareness and education programs to get more consensus for stopping wildlife trade. We want to fund research into better understanding how trade happens region by region. And so an example of this is when we sent Rowan to Angola in partnership with the Ministry of the Environment of Angola and the International Environmental Law Project and the US FWS, along with Wildlife Impact, a team of experts, including Rowan and a vet that we sponsored, Davide, went and provided an intensive training on how to handle African greys, how to build an aviary, how to feed them, how to identify them, how to do health checks, how to do disease screenings. And then ultimately they were able to release that batch of greys back into the wild and connect with the community where the greys had been released to get them to kind of on board to inform the agents if they were seeing poaching activity taking place in the community, so that of course, confiscations could happen much sooner, or poaching could be prevented altogether. Other examples of getting involved in trade, we have the chattering lories and a eclectus in Indonesia. In the lower left-hand corner, so this is a parrot that was nicknamed Mashindi, which means survivor. She had been a part of a group that was released in 2011 in Uganda, and then this was a resighting by Elaine Henley, who had organized an eco tour to go sea graze in the wild 8 years later. And so you can see that she's actually banded, and that's how we were able to identify this individual. She's feeding on wild plants. She was kind of interacting and showing mated behavior to a wild gray that was unbanded. And that's just, that's the optimal conservation outcome, that, a bird that gets caught up in trade has been directly kind of handled by humans can be rehabilitated and released and can thrive in the wild. That is possible. On the right-hand corner, this is a blue-fronted Amazon, which had been released in Brazil at Linz Ecological, which is a new partner for us. They even have blue fronts now breeding on their property, which is really exciting. And they're doing some habitat restoration in order to create more natural nesting cavities for that growing population of released birds on their property. This is a really crude video that was taken from some of our friends that went down to Chiapas, Mexico for a release. Some of you may have heard through World Parrot Trust, if you follow any of our communications, about a confiscation of close to 400 birds from Chiapas, Mexico. I want to say late 2020 it happened. And I mean, these birds just got released last November. So sometimes the rehabilitation process after a confiscation can be very long. There can be very high mortality rates if the birds are in very poor conditions. And that was the case with this group. I mean, so we supported a local vet, Elsie, and her organization called TVU in that area throughout their rehabilitation process. She did a phenomenal job just getting the local community involved. She had a lot of godparents who would symbolically adopt a lot of the individuals that were being rehabilitated. Unfortunately, in that case with that confiscation, they had been misnetted. And so there was a lot of damage to the feathers and to the feet. And then they were just packed into these tiny little crates, and the birds had their feathers cut, and in some cases, the feathers were cut improperly. And so that means that it's going to take a really long time for those feathers to regrow. So finally, after this long journey, they were able to take a small group of 40 birds back to this kind of protected island in partnership with the local natural resources staff, and do a release of about 40 Amazons.
Tomas, cámaras, videos, porque van a salir y ya nadie. Todos vamos a perderlo. Espera.
Un segundo.
And so this is just kind of a temporary aviary space. What they did is they brought the birds back onto this island, and here they are flying out. So they had to transport the birds by boat to get onto this island. They created this very temporary aviary. They had the birds acclimating there for about a week. They knew that this was a good release location because there were other Amazons already in the wild on this island. And so the whole time, this release group was vocalizing and communicating, and the wild Amazons were coming down and checking them out. Like, what is this? Who are these people? And so on the day of the release, I mean, there was almost no hesitation for this group of close to 40 birds to just go right up into the trees. And you can see they just disappear among the leaves. They did put out supplementary. So this is called a soft release. So they brought them onto the site. They had them in the aviary. They had them acclimating to their surroundings. They had them getting familiarized with the resident birds. And then following the release, a small team from the I don't know the name because it's a Mexican entity. It's like the local protected area management team. They stayed on the island and they put out supplementary feeding tables so that any of the released birds that needed to find food knew where they could find food. And they did see several individuals coming back for a few days. And then, after about a week, they just were all off. They had no trouble reacclimating to life in the wild. And all those birds were banded. And in fact, Tivu was fortunate to get microchips. And so they kind of did a lot of hype about the microchips because what they were hoping is that any prospective poachers would say, oh, like not only did they have a band, which I could potentially cut off, they're microchipped, which I can't avoid. So if any of those Amazons that's been released winds up back in captivity, a quick swipe of a wand is going to tell them, oh, this was a released bird, this is an illegal pet, and hopefully it'll get returned right back out to the wild. But ideally, that won't even be the case, that all of these birds are just going to live the rest of their lives happily out in the wild with the birds that they've joined. And so that gets us into education and awareness. It's so important that communities know what it is that we're doing in the field and why we're doing it and how they can be a part of that more than anything. And so in the top left-hand corner, this is Sarah Williams at the Macaw Recovery Network teaching a group of school children about the great green macaws and just kind of getting them excited about their native fauna early on. Same thing with Med Alawate here in Indonesia. In Indonesia, ecotourism is a major part of the economy, and bird tourism, as some of you, if you are enthusiast birders, may know, it can be really, it's like I think billions of dollars in the industry across the world for bird watching. And so for these young people, if they can learn how to identify all of the species of birds that they have on their islands, not just the parrots, then that's a sustainable livelihood that they can engage in more so than poaching a chick, which provides an immediate one-time income, but not a lifetime of income or career. And in the lower left-hand corner, this is back on Honduras. So this is at Macaw Mountain. They have some non-releasable, they were either former pets or they're injured birds that are not suitable for life in the wild. And, they do a lot of education and outreach. They bring local schools in through the sanctuary. They have these macaws interact with them. And that means that these kids, when they see macaws that have been reintroduced and they're suddenly kind of flying around and coming into the population, the community, these kids aren't going to take BB guns and kind of shoot BBs at them because, maybe that's what they used to do for fun, because kids do lots of crazy things and, don't necessarily think about the consequences of their actions sometimes. And so now, having had these direct interactions and learning about these macaws and having a different and deeper appreciation for them, not to say that these particular kids were doing that in the past, but a child will not maybe make those choices when presented that opportunity again. On the lower right-hand corner, this is Julianka, who's the executive director of ECHO. So she took over after me. She is a local Bonairean woman. She was born and raised in Rincon, which is very close to the habitat where the yellow-shouldered Amazon parrots still exist, and she's working with tourism students. So this is a higher level, older group of young people who are entering into the tourism field, which again is a significant part of Bonaire's economy. And if they can learn about habitat restoration, they can identify species of both of fauna and of plants, then that's gonna give them a sustainable career, and it's going to make them the future nature ambassadors for the island, which is all really important for ECHO's work. Education and awareness doesn't just happen in situ. I mean, this is an example of education and raising awareness by all of you taking your time from your evening to sit down with me today and listen through this presentation. You're helping me spread information about World Parrot Trust efforts and why it's important to save parrots in the wild, and why it's important to look out for their optimal care when they're sharing our homes. And so that's in terms of education directly sponsored by the World Parrot Trust, that's where kind of we have maximum impact for companion birds, is just by providing a breadth of materials and really deep information, access to a number of experts about parrots in the wild and in companion care. And so for our membership, we produce a quarterly magazine called Citizen, which is available in 6 different languages. On our website, our encyclopedia has over 1,500 pages of content. It's something I rely on heavily still, even after 4 years on the job, especially when folks contact me with questions about their parrots. Well, I go to the Ask an Expert page and I say, oh, why is my bird plucking? Oh, let me find all of the articles that may explain this. And we also are starting a new podcast and webinar series. So please be on the lookout for those. And as soon as they're up and running, I'll be sure to send that out to all of you so that you can participate in more of these talks and more specific focused talks going on in the future. We have our monthly e-newsletter called Flock Talk, which just kind of gives snapshots and highlights of the current events in the parrot world. And so if you're not already subscribed for that, please do to join us on Flock Talk. And of course, if you're on social media, we're there too, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. And that's just a really great way to stay connected, not only with us, but with our partners. We really try to promote their work and connect our audiences to the people who are making a difference in the world for parrots. So among our content, we do cover topics that relate to your companion bird. And so if you've got questions, please do feel free to shoot those to me in an email. I won't be able to answer them, but I will find the person who can, or I will point you in the best direction I can come up with. We do have an annual event now called Parrots at Home that's happening at the end of June. It's spun off of, these are all like the silver linings of the pandemic, right? So there was this annual event that took place in the UK called Think Parrots. And so we always participated in that. But of course, with the pandemic in 2020, it didn't happen. And so it had to go to a virtual platform. And World Parrot Trust, of course, still wanted to participate. And thankfully, the organizers of Think Parrots were more than happy to allow us to collaborate with them and kind of move it onto Facebook. And we created this Parrots at Home event. And, every year we're kind of learning from our experience. We've made the commitment that, okay, this went really well. As kind of Amy was talking about, this allows you to bring in people from different parts of the world that maybe couldn't have been at an in-person conference 3 years ago. And so this is something that World Parrot Trust has committed to trying to do annually, where it'll be this virtual Parrots at Home event where we bring a variety of speakers talking about different companion bird topics, questions, interesting tidbits, things that you maybe already know for yourself, but might enjoy seeing again, or participating in some way with us in that. So please do be on the lookout for that. That comes at the end of June, as I said. And of course, that's following on the heels of World Parrot Day, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is on May 31st. So if you're not already finding ways that your clubs can celebrate World Parrot Day on May 31st, please do give a think to that. If you're not already members of the World Parrot Trust, I would, of course, cordially invite you to join us. Please feel free to reach out to me and learn more about what we're doing and how you can participate and how you can support that work. And this is sorry. This is a quick thank you page. It jumped on me. To all of the people who make our work possible, not only you all as supporters and participants in listening to me tonight, but these are funders who have provided us grants and donations to enable the work of our partners on the ground. And without them, really, and without you, what we do would not be possible. So with that, oh my gosh, my screen is jumping again. I will open it to this lovely picture for questions.
Wonderful. I love this picture, Lauren. All right. Wonderful. Well, I know I have a ton of questions and I'll open it up to questions, but first I just want to really thank you for this overview of World Parrot Trust. And I strongly encourage everyone who's not a member and whose organizations aren't members to join, because World Parrot Trust is the world's largest organization dedicated to helping parrots in the wild. And I personally strongly feel that everyone who has a parrot should also think about parrots in the wild and where they come from and what pressures are on them, and support this. And if you have certain specific projects like ECHO or one of the other projects you want to support, you can do that through World Parrot Trust by directing funds to that particular project. But I really can't think of a better organization for helping parrots in the wild, which is hopefully why we're all here today, because we're interested in learning about that. So I know probably a lot of people have questions. I've been keeping a list myself. I'll probably just start with a couple, open it up and put more in. But does World Parrot Trust ever outright buy land to keep it away from habitat destruction? Or at least help facilitate purchases of land so that those areas can hopefully never be, for example, legally logged. Right. I know people could go on and poach parrots, but at least take land out of the hands of developers.
Fantastic question. And that is definitely a new venture for us. So I would say that at the moment, we do not outright own any properties for protection, and but that is, yeah, that's an area of development for us. So, sorry to be so vague, but more to come soon, I'm sure.
I know, like in my town, there's a land conservation trust that's trying to basically buy up all the land they can so it can never be developed and have houses on it, which I think is a great idea. So
there's another organization that has done that in Argentina, and they have green wings in there, and so we will work specifically for things relating to the parrots that are on their land, but we are working towards finding, again, it's about being strategic, where can we get the most value for our dollar, because our donor dollars are important to us. We want to be really conscientious and thinking about the long-term management costs, and making sure, as you said, that once it's one thing to kind of call a piece of property protected, it's another thing to enforce that level of protection. And so there's all of those factors that need to be really thoughtfully considered before moving towards an acquisition like that, but certainly of interest to us.
Anybody who wants to ask questions, just jump in or raise your hand or whatever. If we a lot of people at one time.
I see Robert has his hand up.
I just first of all want to thank you on a presentation tonight that has literally blown me away, and I had to bring both my birds in to watch you.
Thank you.
The education tonight for all of us is great, but I just got to tell you something. What you're doing in the world for the wild parrots is wonderful. And I just learned something from my own granddaughter the other day at 9 years old that I think everybody should know about. I had a video of Romeo, my umbrella cockatoo, playing in a drawer full of 40 pairs of socks, and he was promptly throwing everyone out. And my granddaughter was so entertained. And I said to myself, you know, what every family should be working on that owns parrots is getting the young children involved in the socialization so that we successfully pass the baton in future years and keep birds in our families where they belong and keep them out of the adoption pools if it's possible. And education, either from you or all of us, is the key to all of our successes. And thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Robert, for those comments. I wholeheartely agree. I mean, especially when we're talking about these longer lived species, thinking about where are they going to be best placed and where are they going to live their lives happily is of such concern for all of us. And we will occasionally get calls from folks who feel that the best interest of their bird might be to return that bird to the wild. And I'm here to say that we actually have a statement published about that oftentimes for birds that have been raised in captivity and know you as their only companion, the best thing for them is to be with somebody who is most like you and who they get along with, because you are everything for them. And that is in the best interest of the bird. So yeah, being really cognizant of the individual needs of our birds, whether they're in the wild or in our homes, is so important. So thanks for that comment.
Thank you.
Right. Right. Lauren, you mentioned a lot of parts of the world. I didn't hear anything about Australia. Do you have any programs in Australia, which of course is one of the areas with the highest amount of parrots in the world?
So to my knowledge, there's no active projects that we are involved in at this time. We do have work going on in New Zealand. We have a partner, like a branch of the World Parrot Trust, a representative in Australia. She just a few days ago actually gave a presentation about some of our work in Indonesia. And so we have a presence. We're connected with folks on the ground doing research, doing work. I don't know of anything where I at least have been involved at the moment. Not to say that it's not happening. I just might not be aware of it. So I will check on that and let you know.
I mean, certainly the organizations that are working with the orange-bellied parrots and the swift parrots, I'm sure could use partnerships and funds desperately.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. So we work with a charity very similarly named called the New Zealand Parrot Trust, which has just recently in the last few years become established. And so anything happening in that part of the world is likely filtering through them, and they're the ones. And then, we will work with them how we can direct our support if and as needed. So yes, I'll let you know. I'll look into that.
Yeah, I'm sure the need is great, and maybe it's a money thing, but so we have a couple questions in the chat. Has the trust approached the billionaires of the world, such as Bezos, into buying the Amazon and other lands?
We have worked with some major companies, but to answer the question, no, we've not yet gotten to the Bezos level. We have inroads with parts of Amazon, and Amazon has recently been given a large donation to a unrelated organization. So we have some connections there, but not at the moment. We have not done that. And I see the follow-up question about working with Bonnie Zimmerman in Indonesia. I think this is the Indonesia Parrot Project. In the past, we have worked together. I believe at the moment, the two organizations are not collaborating. They have separate projects and kind of doing their own thing. But of course, wherever there's opportunity for overlap and ways to work together, we're always open to that and seeking that.
Yes, similarly, I see you work with a certain Bolivian organization. I saw no mention of Armenia, which to me is the
correct
organization there.
Armenia is supported, and I saw a question from Stace, and so I'll make sure I get to you next. Armenia is supported by BirdLife International and I believe by Rainforest Trust. Wherever we are working with local partners and communities in Bolivia, in the Beni, Armenia is invited to the table. They, again, have a different approach, and while we remain open to conversations and working together, finding ways to work together, that just has not happened. So.
First of all, you are amazing and brilliant, unbelievable. It just blows me away, really. But is there any trade that's good trade, or is all the trade bad trade?
You know, I made a comment about stopping wildlife trade, and I kind of caught myself and realized that maybe I was broad brush stroking the subject of trade. I think they do calculations, right, on populations. And so estimates are made as to what is a sustainable level of trade. I think for the World Parrot Trust, any removal of species from the wild is not desirable. Particularly where we know that those species are being bred successfully in captivity. I think a really strong argument would need to be made why this was of necessity to remove these individuals from the wild populations. Yeah. Thanks for that question, though, Stacey. I see some other.
Oh,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
Sorry. I saw a few questions popping up in the chat. And so Kakapo conservation, we are doing a little bit. We're supporting some organizations that are kind of already well established in doing Kakapo work. We have some projects kind of getting up and running this coming year. I'd have to check on the specific details of that, though. I'm sorry. So if who is this, Kim? If you want to shoot me an email, I can try to give you more details on ways we're specifically involved in anything relating to kakapos. Would I be willing to make a Zoom presentation to the West Coast birders through the South Bay Bird Society in April? Certainly, please, Gala, reach out to me, send me an email, and we can look at ways to get that organized and scheduled. Happy to spread the word wherever I can. Amy?
Put your email in the chat, please, Lauren.
Excellent. Good suggestion. I'll do that. So I'll give everybody just our very generic email. I assure you, I'm a one-woman office here, so this will reach me. So please feel free to reach out.
Now, do you do anything with helping local communities set up ecotourism for parrot tours, wildlife tours?
Oh, good question.
That's a great question. So there's so many things we at the World Parrot Trust would like to do, and so many hats we would like to wear, and certainly kind of our own branded approach and take on viewing parrots in the wild. I mean, these Zoom presentations are fantastic for giving you nearly firsthand views of what what a parrot in the wild looks like. It's not the same as actually being there in person. The short answer is, at the moment, no, we're not sponsoring any of our own trips. We have one annual person working with us, Carol Cipriano out of Pennsylvania. She organizes an annual Parrot Lovers Cruise. That's about as close as we get to ecotourism. And she, thankfully, is rerunning her cruise, like it's back up and running this coming year. So if you're interested, please do definitely look for details on that. But yeah, we've had established tour companies who are focused on nature conservation, nature viewing, approach us and help work. We work together to do customized tours, and World Parrot Trust receives like a portion of those proceeds of what they generate from those tours, but we've not organized any of our own. I tend to give very long-winded answers, so I'm sorry if I'll try to be briefer in my responses. Projects to relocate species to another area due to fire destruction. That's a fantastic question. Specifically in response to fire destruction, not that I'm aware of. We have done targeted reintroductions of species from areas where they've gone extinct. So this was an important differentiation that I only recently learned. So there's two things when you're talking about bringing animals back out into the wild. There's reintroductions and there's reinforcement. So reintroduction is where a subpopulation used to occur. It's been decimated and it's no longer existent for whatever reason, whether that's trapping or whether it was habitat loss. And so for example, the case with Aruba, World Parrot Trust with ECHO would like to see a reintroduction of yellow-shouldered Amazons onto the island of Aruba. And we're working closely with the National Park on Aruba to see how we can make that happen. A reinforcement is where there is still a resident wild population, but it's very small in number. And so by doing a targeted release of additional individuals into that population, you can support its growth and support its stability. And so, yeah, but specifically in response to fire destruction, not that I'm aware of World Parrot Trust being directly involved in.
You mentioned about, oh, go ahead, Diane, I'll ask my question.
Sorry, Amy, stepping on you.
I just always have tons of questions.
Me too.
I know.
So very, very much. This is so fascinating. I'd like to put up my picture of the blue-throated macaws.
Beautiful.
And this the Laney Rickman Foundation. So I think that it is so important for everyone who is owned by a companion parrot to find out more about their parrot, where their parrot comes from, and is there a particular species on the endangered species list or threatened list, and to see what they can do in their parrot's name to help their brothers and sisters in the wild. I did have the opportunity to go on a parrot lovers cruise, and we went to Bonaire.
Oh, right. Oh, you must have been there just before I got there. So we just missed each other.
Yeah, so it was in 2018, and Carol had set up a tour of ECHO and the Long Island Parrot Society. We took down a whole bunch of stuff for those yellow-shouldered Amazons and everything else. So we had a blast. The island of Bonaire is more than fabulous. We went to all three islands. We did the ABC islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. And I must say that the Bonaire was the one that I liked the most, and because of how natural it is and what a wonderful job they do ecology-wise. But again, so important, the conservation. It's one thing to share our homes, but we have to make sure that the birds that are still out there in the wild are being taken care of too. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you, Diane.
Absolutely, Diane. In fact, I just read a few days ago that there are going to be a number of parrot species that are going to be upgraded being bad, to more endangered, more critically endangered in this year's reassessment of the IUCN Red List. So things are for the most part going in the wrong direction.
Just want to mention really quickly, membership is only $40. I just joined.
All right. High five. Thank you so much.
And the magazine now, you can get it either by mail, or I think you can still get it by mail, but it comes to you electronic form, which is great because then you can save it and search it. And those the flock talk that comes every week, or every couple of weeks, maybe once a month, I'm not sure, Bayhow, it's excellent, has all kinds of interesting information. And of course, the encyclopedic World Parrot Trust site. So it's you definitely get a lot for your money, but most importantly, knowing that you're helping to conserve parrots in the wild, which is the most important thing.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm going to proselytize here. So I have a question about the bees, because I've been reading about how bees take over nesting sites. I know it's a big problem in Australia. They've taken over a lot of the swift parrot sites. And I was curious what they're doing about that. Like, for example, could you set up, just like we set up nesting boxes for parrots, could we set up hives that would draw the bees away from the nesting boxes, or would that just bring more bees into the area? So what kinds of, do you know anything about what kinds of methods they're using to work with the bees?
That's a fantastic question. So again, it will kind of depend on the place where that's an issue. In most cases, I'd say they're primarily interested in just driving the bees out. We don't see often that they're using lethal methods for exterminating the colonies in order to free up the cavities for the parrots. On Bonaire with Echo, under the leadership of Sam Williams, so he just preceded me, he founded the organization. He had the ambition to create create bee boxes. And so the idea was that you would set out a swarm trap, you would put pheromones in it, you would lure the bees away from the cavity, they would set up their colony in these swarm traps, and then you could relocate them into these little bee boxes and sustainably harvest honey. And like, it's a win-win-win, you know, the parrots get their cavity, the bees get their colony, like they're safe, and we get honey, and it would be great. And we tested it, and with the help of a local kind of expert on bees, we were able to get one of the bee boxes up and going and producing honey. But it was just, for us at the time, with habitat restoration being kind of our main focus and a huge investment of our team's time and the funds that we had available, that just took kind of a back seat. Now, that is a sustainable, awesome approach if there's the capacity to do it. So I'd say it's possible. It's not always realistic.
So basically, if you had more money, you could do a lot of these things.
And larger teams. It's so the challenge with conservation is part of one of the major parts of my role is to write grants and convince foundations and other, you know, entities to give us money to do our work. And oftentimes folks don't necessarily want to pay the human resources that's necessary to do the work. They want to put up the nest boxes. They want to feed the parrots. And, you know, obviously you can't do any of those things without the humans involved. And so that's where, you know, having that kind of indirect, generalized support from donors, from memberships, that's what allows World Parrot Trust to have the flexibility to add investments, add support where it's needed most, because, you know, it's worthwhile. Like we believe in paying people to do good work, and there's value in that.
Excellent. Do we have
Cool.
some more questions people want to jump in? Oh, here's an article Diane posted about bees and nesting boxes. Excellent.
I am going to check that out. Thank you for that, Diane.
Yes. Okay. So feel free to just jump in with any other questions people have. Okay. Maybe we don't have any more.
I've answered all the questions you may have.
But as you know, Lauren put her email there, but feel free to email additional questions that may come to you if you want to talk to her, if you want to book her for your group, if any other group. Oh, Diane's smiling. Yeah, I think this should definitely be a LIPS meeting. Even though we have a lot of LIPS people here, I'm sure there are a lot of people who aren't here, and you can ask more questions and all that. So I think that would be wonderful. All right. I'm going to turn off the recording.